Max's Roadhouse, a dimly lit bar in rural Tennessee, was a sanctuary of calm for many of its patrons, especially for those seeking refuge from the chaos of daily life. On most nights, its regulars included General Robert Miller, a 90-year-old World War II veteran who sat quietly at his corner table, nursing a whiskey neat. The walls of the bar were adorned with memorabilia, from old sports jerseys to faded pictures of soldiers, all contributing to the nostalgic aura of the place. That night, the serenity shattered when a group of rowdy football hooligans burst through the doors. Their loud laughter and coarse banter cut through the low hum of conversation, immediately commanding attention. They were young, clad in team jerseys, and reeked of cheap beer and arrogance. Spotting the elderly general, one of them nudged his friends, a sinister grin spreading across his face. "Hey, Grandpa," one jeered, his voice dripping with mockery. "What are you doing here? Shouldn't you be in a nursing home?" The bar fell silent, and all eyes turned toward the confrontation. Robert didn't flinch. His steel-gray eyes, sharp despite his age, met the hooligan's stares without wavering. He took a deliberate sip of his whiskey, his hands steady, ignoring the taunts. The leader of the group, emboldened by the lack of immediate reaction, strode over to the table. His friends followed, forming a semicircle around Robert. "What's the matter, old man? Cat got your tongue? Or are you just too senile to understand what I'm saying?" Another chimed in. "Maybe he's deaf. Let's see if we can jog his memory about who's in charge here." One of them grabbed Robert's walking cane, twirling it mockingly. "Look at this," he exclaimed, holding it up for his friends to see. The mighty warrior's weapon of choice. The bartender, a burly man named Joe, moved to intervene, but Robert raised a hand, signaling him to stay back. His voice, though quiet, carried an undeniable authority. "You boys don't want to do this." The hooligans laughed, their leader leaning in close to Robert. "Oh yeah? What are you gonna do, old man? Call in an airstrike?" The air grew thick with tension. Robert set his glass down and straightened in his chair, his weathered hands resting on the table. "Son," he said, his voice calm but firm, "I've seen men twice your size and 10 times your courage fall before me. So, unless you want a lesson in humility, I suggest you sit down and enjoy your evening." The room seemed to hold its breath. The leader sneered, but a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. He stepped closer, towering over the seated general, his bravado faltering under the intensity of Robert's gaze. "Listen here, old-timer," the leader spat, his voice cracking slightly. "You think you're tough because you've got a couple of medals? That don't mean squat to us." Robert's eyes flicked to the medals pinned on his jacket, a silver star and a purple heart, symbols of his sacrifice and valor. He stood slowly, his movements deliberate, and the room seemed to shrink around him. Though frail in appearance, there was an undeniable presence about him, a weight of history and experience that silenced even the most reckless among the hooligans. "You think courage is about puffing out your chest and yelling the loudest?" Robert said, his voice cutting through the silence. "Courage is staying calm under fire. It's standing up for what's right, even when you're scared out of your mind. And respect. Respect is earned, not taken." The leader faltered, but one of his friends, desperate to regain their dominance, stepped forward and shoved Robert. The old man staggered but didn't fall. Gasps rippled through the bar as Joe vaulted over the counter, ready to intervene. Before he could, Robert raised his hand again. "This is your last chance," Robert said, his voice cold as steel. "Walk away." But the shove had emboldened the group. They laughed, egging each other on. "What's he gonna do? Call the retirement home to pick him up?" one quipped. Suddenly, Robert moved. In a blur of motion belying his age, he snatched his cane from the leader's grasp and used it to sweep his legs out from under him. The hooligan hit the floor with a thud, the wind knocked out of him. The crowd erupted in cheers and applause as the others hesitated, unsure of their next move. "Don't mistake kindness for weakness," Robert said, his tone sharp. "This cane has been with me through hell and back. It's not just for walking." The remaining hooligans backed off, helping their fallen leader to his feet. Embarrassed and outmatched, they retreated toward the door, muttering curses under their breath. The bar erupted into cheers as the group slunk away. Joe clapped Robert on the shoulder, grinning. "You've still got it, General." Robert sat back down, his demeanor calm once more. He raised his glass to the crowd, who toasted him in return. For the rest of the evening, the bar buzzed with excitement, the story of the old soldier's stand spreading like wildfire. As the night wore on, Robert remained at his table, quietly sipping his whiskey. He didn't seek the spotlight, but in that moment, he was a hero once again, reminding everyone that true strength comes not from muscle but from spirit. The laughter from the hooligans grew louder as Tommy, their brash leader, snatched General Robert Miller's military cap from the table. He twirled it in his hands, his mocking grin wide enough to show the gaps in his teeth. "Look at this relic," Tommy sneered, holding it up for his gang to see. "Hey, Grandpa, did you get this from the museum, or are you just a living exhibit yourself?" The group roared with laughter, their voices bouncing off the wooden walls of Max's Roadhouse. The other patrons sat in stunned silence, glancing nervously at one another. Joe, the bartender, clenched his fists behind the counter but knew better than to act without Robert's signal. Robert sat unmoved, his weathered face as still as stone. His sharp gray eyes locked onto Tommy, who mistook his silence for submission. Tommy leaned closer, his breath reeking of stale beer and arrogance. "What's the matter, old man? Cat got your tongue? Or maybe your dentures fell out?" The gang howled, doubling over in fits of laughter. One of them, a wiry guy with tattoos snaking up his arms, added fuel to the fire. "Maybe he's too busy reminiscing about the good old days when segregation was still a thing," he said, his words laced with venomous mockery. The gang erupted again, their taunts taking on a cruel, racial edge. "Bet he's one of those who still thinks America was great back then," Tommy said, his voice dripping with disdain. "You probably missed the days when you didn't have to sit next to people like us." The comment hung in the air, heavy with implication. Tommy's words were a direct jab at Joe, the bartender, who was African American. Joe stiffened but kept his composure, his eyes darting to Robert, silently asking for permission to act. Tommy smirked as he noticed the tension he'd created. "Oh, I get it. You're all too scared to do anything about us. That's right. This is our turf now." Still, Robert didn't move. Instead, he slowly reached for his glass and took a measured sip of his whiskey. His deliberate calm only seemed to irritate Tommy more. The hooligan stepped closer, slamming the military cap onto the table in front of Robert. "Pick it up, old man," he commanded, his voice a low growl. "Pick it up and salute me like the coward you are." A murmur rippled through the bar as the patrons exchanged worried glances. One woman whispered to her friend, "Why doesn't he do something? They're humiliating him." Her friend replied, "Just wait. You don't know General Miller." Tommy, emboldened by what he perceived as cowardice, turned his attention to Joe. "Hey, barkeep, get me and my boys another round. Or do I need to teach you how to serve a proper drink?" Joe's jaw tightened, but he didn't move. "I think you've had enough," he said, his voice steady despite the obvious threat. Tommy laughed darkly. "Oh, we've had enough, huh? And who are you to decide that? Just a nobody behind a bar." He turned to his gang and added, "Bet this guy's ancestors knew their place better than he does." The comment sent a chill through the room. Joe opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, Robert spoke. His voice was quiet, but carried the weight of authority. "That's enough." Tommy whipped around, his smirk fading as he met Robert's unwavering gaze. "Oh, now you've got something to say, huh, Grandpa?" Robert stood slowly, his imposing presence despite his age silencing the bar once more. "You can insult me all you want," he said, his tone calm but lethal. "But you've crossed a line with your words, boy. And I won't stand by while you disrespect this man or anyone else in this establishment." Tommy rolled his eyes, feigning boredom. "Spare me the lecture, old-timer. You think you're still in command here? Newsflash, your time's over." "Time doesn't erase character," Robert shot back. "And it doesn't make cowards into men. But maybe you'll learn that lesson tonight." The room tensed as Tommy's grin twisted into a snarl. "Oh, you want to teach me a lesson? Let's see you try. Before anyone could stop him, Tommy lunged. But Robert was ready. In one swift motion, he sidestepped the charge and used his cane to sweep Tommy's legs out from under him. The leader hit the ground hard, a stunned gasp escaping his lips as the air was knocked out of him. The gang surged forward, but Joe leapt over the counter, grabbing a baseball bat he kept for emergencies. "Back off," he shouted, his voice booming. "Sit down," Robert barked, his military tone freezing the gang in their tracks. For a moment, they hesitated, their bravado faltering under the combined glare of Robert and Joe. Tommy, still on the ground, groaned and tried to push himself up. "You'll pay for that," he spat, but his voice lacked its former confidence. Robert loomed over him, his cane pressed lightly against Tommy's chest to keep him down. "Respect isn't given," he said coldly. "It's earned. And you, son, have earned nothing tonight." The bar erupted into applause and cheers as the gang, thoroughly humiliated, scrambled to retreat. Joe stood guard at the door, ensuring they left without further incident. As the dust settled, Robert returned to his seat, adjusting his military cap with quiet dignity. Joe placed a fresh drink in front of him and said, "On the house, General." The patrons began to relax, but the lesson of the night lingered. The old soldier had shown them all that courage and character never age, and that some battles are worth fighting, no matter how the odds might seem. The jeers and taunts didn't stop, but Robert remained seated, his expression calm and composed. The old general seemed unshaken, as if the insults hurled at him were nothing more than the idle noise of a passing storm. His weathered hands rested lightly on the table, and his gaze held steady on Tommy and his gang, who were growing bolder by the minute. "You think this is funny, don't you?" Tommy sneered, still nursing the bruises to his pride after being knocked down earlier. He rubbed his knee, a smirk creeping back across his face as he leaned closer to Robert. "Big war hero, sitting here like you own the place. Guess what, old man? Your time's over." Robert didn't flinch. Instead, he picked up his drink and took a slow, deliberate sip before setting the glass back down. "Son," he said, his voice low but carrying through the room, "you do well not to underestimate people you don't know." Tommy scoffed, his gang laughing along with him. "Oh, we know you, Grandpa. You're just some relic with one foot in the grave. What are you gonna do, bore us with your war stories?" A murmur of disapproval rippled through the bar, but no one dared to intervene. Joe, standing near the counter with his bat still within reach, kept his eyes trained on the gang. Several patrons shifted in their seats, torn between staying to see what would happen next and slipping out quietly to avoid the growing tension. "War stories," Robert repeated, his tone calm but sharp. "You wouldn't last a day in one of my stories, boy. And if you think strength is about how loud you can shout or how hard you can push, you're more lost than I thought." Tommy's smirk faltered for a split second before he masked it with a laugh. "Big talk for an old man who can barely stand without a cane." Robert leaned forward slightly, his eyes locking with Tommy's. "This cane," he said, tapping it lightly against the floor, "has seen more battles than you've seen birthdays. And it's still here, just like me." The gang laughed, but there was a nervous edge to it now. One of them, the wiry tattooed man who had made the earlier racist comment, stepped forward. His grin was cruel, his tone mocking. "You think you're still a big shot, huh? You and your kind. You don't run the world anymore. People like us do now." The comment hung in the air, its meaning clear. The tension in the bar ratcheted up as Joe's knuckles whitened around the handle of his bat. One of the regulars, an older black man named Earl who had been quietly sipping his beer, shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening. Robert didn't rise to the bait. Instead, he glanced around the room, his eyes landing on Joe and Earl before returning to the Hooligans. "People like you?" he asked, his voice cutting through the strained silence. "You mean cowards who hide behind insults and numbers? Or are you talking about something else?" The wiry man's grin vanished, replaced by a scowl. "Watch your mouth, old man," he snapped, stepping closer. Robert's gaze never wavered. "No, you watch yours. You don't know the first thing about respect or strength. And judging by the way you carry yourselves, You've never had to fight for anything real in your lives. Tommy, sensing his gang was losing face, pushed himself back into the fray. You don't know us, he snarled, his face red with anger. You don't know what we've been through. Robert tilted his head slightly, studying Tommy as if he were an unruly recruit. Maybe not, he said, but I know this. You're trying to prove something. And let me tell you, boy, picking fights with people who've seen real battle isn't how you do it. Tommy's jaw clenched, his fists balling at his sides. The gang exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier bravado fading under the weight of Robert's words. But Tommy wasn't ready to back down. He jabbed a finger toward Robert, his voice rising. You think you're better than us? Huh. Sitting there, talking like you're some kind of king? You're nothing. Robert smiled faintly, a ghost of a grin that only seemed to further infuriate Tommy. I don't think I'm better than anyone, he said. But I do know this. If you don't learn respect, the world will teach it to you the hard way. And trust me, it'll hurt a lot more than this conversation. Tommy's face twisted with rage. He grabbed a nearby beer bottle and smashed it against the edge of the table, the sharp edges glinting in the dim light. You've got one more chance to shut up, old man, he hissed, waving the jagged bottle toward Robert. Or I'll make you regret every word you just said. The bar froze. Joe took a step forward, his bat raised, but Robert held up a hand, stopping him. Slowly, Robert stood, his posture straight and steady despite his age. He looked Tommy in the eye, his expression calm but unyielding. Go ahead, Robert said, his voice like ice. Make your move. But know this. If you come at me, you'd better be ready for what happens next. Tommy hesitated. For all his bravado, there was something in Robert's tone, something in his eyes, that gave him pause. The gang exchanged nervous glances, their leader's uncertainty sapping their own courage. You're not worth it, Tommy spat, throwing the broken bottle to the ground. He turned to his gang and barked, let's get out of here. As they slunk toward the door, the bar erupted into applause. Earl raised his beer in salute, and Joe set down his bat, shaking his head in admiration. Robert sat back down, adjusting his cap as if nothing had happened. Joe placed another drink in front of him, grinning. On the house, General. Robert nodded his thanks and took a sip. Around him, the bar buzzed with excitement, the tension finally giving way to relief. But through it all, Robert remained calm, his quiet strength a reminder of the battles he'd fought and won, long before this night. As the tension in Max's Roadhouse reached a boiling point, Joe the bartender, who had been watching the scene unfold with mounting frustration, decided it was time to step in. Wiping his hands on a rag, he stepped out from behind the counter and planted himself squarely between General Robert Miller and Tommy's gang. His imposing frame and sharp glare commanded attention. Enough, Joe barked, his voice cutting through the low murmurs of the other patrons. He pointed at Tommy and his gang, his hands steady despite the fury in his eyes. You think you're making a statement here? Harassing an old man? Acting like a pack of rabid dogs? Let me tell you something about the man you're messing with. Tommy crossed his arms, feigning indifference, but the rest of his gang exchanged uncertain glances. Joe's voice rose, and his words carried the weight of truth and admiration. That man right there, he said, pointing at Robert, is General Robert Miller, a soldier who fought in Vietnam, the Persian Gulf, and plenty of battles you'll never read about in your history books. He's not just some old guy sitting in the corner. He's a damn hero. He's got more courage in his little finger than you've got in your whole gang. The room fell silent, save for the faint crackle of the neon beer signs and the distant hum of a jukebox. Tommy's sneer faltered as he glanced at Robert, who remained seated, his gaze unwavering. Joe wasn't finished. He stepped closer to Tommy, towering over him. You think you're tough? You think breaking bottles and mouthing off makes you a man? Let me tell you something. This man's walked through hell and back. He's seen things that'd make you cry for your mama. And you want to talk about respect? He's earned it, not by running his mouth, but by standing up for what's right, no matter the cost. One of the hooligans, the wiry man with tattoos, scoffed. So what? He's old news. The world's changed. Ain't no place for people like him anymore. Joe's eyes narrowed, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. You're right about one thing. The world's changed. But let me tell you this. It hasn't changed so much that scum like you get to walk in here and disrespect a man like General Miller. Not while I'm standing here. Tommy, his face red with humiliation, tried to recover. Why are you defending him so much? He's just an old relic, living off his glory days. Joe didn't flinch. You know why? Because men like him made it possible for you to run your mouth without fear. He fought for your right to be as stupid as you are right now. And I'll be damned if I let you spit on that sacrifice in my bar. The gang shifted uncomfortably, their earlier bravado rapidly dissolving under Joe's blistering words and the weight of Robert's silent presence. Tommy, desperate to regain control, jabbed a finger at Joe. You think you're better than us, huh? Just 'cause you own this place and know some old war stories? Joe chuckled darkly, shaking his head. Better than you? No. But I'm smart enough to know when I'm out of my depth, and right now, so are you. Robert, who had been quietly observing, finally stood. The room seemed to hold its breath as the old general stepped forward, his military cap now resting firmly on his head. Joe, Robert said, his tone calm but firm, you don't have to fight my battles for me. Joe nodded, but didn't move from his spot. I know, General, but some fights need two soldiers. Robert allowed a faint smile before turning his full attention to Tommy and his gang. You boys seem to think strength comes from tearing others down, he said. But real strength? It's standing up for something bigger than yourself. It's fighting for the people who can't fight for themselves. Tommy, his bravado a fragile veneer, snorted. What do you know about strength? You're just a tired old man. Robert stepped closer, his piercing gray eyes locking onto Tommy's. I know more about strength than you ever will. And I know what weakness looks like. It looks like a pack of bullies, trying to prove something they'll never be. The room erupted in applause, the patrons finally breaking their silence to cheer for the general and Joe. Earl raised his beer in salute, his deep voice cutting through the noise. Damn right, General. You tell him. Tommy's gang began to back toward the door, their earlier confidence shattered. One of them muttered, Let's get out of here. But Tommy wasn't ready to let it go. Fine, Tommy spat, his voice shaking with frustration. But don't think this is over, old man. We'll be back. Robert tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. You'll be back? He repeated, his voice soft but cutting. Then let me make it clear. You'll always leave worse off than when you came in. The gang finally slunk out the door, their tails between their legs. As the door slammed shut, the bar erupted into cheers and applause once again. Joe returned to his place behind the counter, shaking his head in disbelief. General, he said, pouring Robert another drink. I don't know how you stay so calm. Robert took the glass, his hand steady. Years of practice, he said simply, before raising it in a silent toast to Joe and the rest of the bar. For the rest of the night, the patrons of Max's Roadhouse shared stories, laughed, and reveled in the strength and dignity of the old general who had shown them all what true courage looked like. Robert, ever the quiet hero, sat back at his table, his eyes scanning the room with a quiet pride that no hooligan could ever take away. Tommy and his gang stood in stunned silence as Joe's words and General Robert Miller's unwavering presence sank in. The bravado that had carried them through their bullying evaporated like steam, leaving behind an awkward, uncomfortable quiet. The weight of humiliation pressed on Tommy's chest as he looked at the old man whose dignity and strength had withstood their cruelty. Look, Tommy stammered, his eyes darting nervously between Robert and the crowd. We didn't mean any harm. We were just messing around, you know? His voice cracked, and the gang behind him shifted uneasily. The arrogance that had fueled their earlier taunts was now replaced with sheepish glances and the awkward shuffling of feet. One of the younger hooligans, barely out of his teens, muttered, Yeah, we're sorry, man. We didn't know who you were. Robert, standing tall with his cane in hand, remained silent for a long moment, letting the weight of the situation hang in the air. Finally, he spoke, his voice measured and calm. You didn't know who I was, he said, his gaze sweeping over each of them. And that's supposed to excuse your behavior? That's the problem with men like you. You think respect is something you give only to those you deem worthy. Tommy's face flushed, and he glanced down at his shoes, unable to meet Robert's piercing gaze. We're sorry, all right? We messed up. Yes, you did, Robert replied, his tone firm but devoid of anger. He turned to address the entire bar, his voice rising slightly. But let me tell you something. It's not me you need to apologize to. It's every person you've ever disrespected, every person you've judged or humiliated because they didn't fit your narrow view of what deserves kindness. The room fell silent again, the weight of Robert's words settling heavily on everyone present. The general's gaze softened as he continued, his voice tinged with the wisdom of years and the pain of experience. I've seen true strength, he said, and it doesn't look like bullying or shouting. True strength is sacrifice. It's standing up for others, even when it costs you everything. It's humility, the courage to admit when you're wrong and to do better. He paused, his eyes distant for a moment, as if recalling a memory. In Vietnam, I saw young men who didn't have the luxury of arrogance. They fought not for glory or recognition, but for each other. I've seen soldiers carry their wounded brothers for miles, through enemy fire, because leaving them behind was never an option. That's strength, and it's something you'll never know if you keep walking the path you're on. Tommy shifted uncomfortably, his earlier confidence reduced to a flicker. We get it, he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. We'll do better. Robert's sharp eyes narrowed as he stepped closer to Tommy, his cane tapping lightly against the floor with each step. Words are cheap, boy, he said. It's your actions that will prove whether or not you mean it. The question is, are you man enough to change? Tommy looked up at Robert, his face a mixture of shame and determination. Yes, sir, he said, his voice steadier now. We'll change. I promise. The general nodded slightly, then turned to the rest of the bar. And the rest of you, he said, his tone softer now but still commanding. Remember this moment. Every person in this room has their own battles, their own scars. Some are visible, others are not. Show respect, no matter who you're dealing with. It's the least we owe each other. The bar erupted into applause, a wave of respect and admiration washing over the patrons. Even Earl, who rarely showed much emotion, raised his glass high in salute. Joe nodded approvingly from behind the counter, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Robert, ever composed, gave the room one final glance before adjusting his cap and turning toward the door. He moved slowly but with purpose, his cane tapping out a steady rhythm as he left the bar. The door swung shut behind him, and for a moment, the room remained silent, as if the general's presence lingered even in his absence. Tommy and his gang stood by the counter, their earlier swagger completely gone. One of them, the wiry tattooed man, spoke up. We messed up bad, huh? Yeah, Tommy said quietly, rubbing the back of his neck. We did. But we're gonna fix it. The gang slowly made their way out, their heads hung low. Joe watched them go, his expression a mix of satisfaction and hope. Maybe they'll learn something, he said to Earl, who nodded in agreement. The patrons gradually returned to their conversations, but the atmosphere in the bar had shifted. People spoke more quietly, their words tinged with a newfound respect for one another. Earl leaned over to Joe and said, That old man. He's something else. Joe smiled. He's more than something else. He's a reminder of what we should all strive to be. Outside, Robert walked into the cool Tennessee night, his figure silhouetted against the glow of the streetlights. His face was calm, but there was a faint glimmer of satisfaction in his eyes. He knew he'd made a difference tonight, however small, and as he walked home, he carried with him the quiet pride of a man who had once again stood for what was right. Inside Max's Roadhouse, the lesson lingered. The patrons, the staff, and even the hooligans who had come looking for trouble all carried away something far more valuable, a reminder of the importance of respect, humility, and the unseen battles that every person might be fighting. And in that, General Robert Miller's legacy grew a little brighter, etched not just in medals and stories, but in the hearts of those he'd touched.